At the end of the Cold War, it seemed that the conflict between ideologies and types of governments had come to an end under the wing of American hegemony. Liberal democracy had won out and became the main governmental type across the globe. The Soviet Union abandoned communism, and many of the seceding states after it broke up accepted democracy. All of the Eastern European states in its sphere and Mongolia followed its path. At the end of the 1980s, countries across Eastern Asia democratized. South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines established themselves as democratic republics and capitalist. Every country in Latin America other than Cuba and Haiti attempted democracy by 1995. The right-wing authoritarian states of Europe, Portugal, Greece, and Spain all transitioned into democracies by the 1970s. The apartheid ended in 1994, and the influence of the white man in Africa finally came to an end. And America and Western Europe demanded that many of the countries throughout the Third World, and throughout Africa especially, play the song and dance of democracy in order to earn aid. Yet universal democracy is not the end point of history. Rather, it is something which follows in the wake of America's influence. The world is now returning to its natural order, a multipolar system, and as such, the pressure to conform to a democratic form of government is fading. As America declines, nations no longer feel pressured to obey its ideology and will start going their own way. One of the prime reasons for America's hegemony and global legitimacy to decline is not soft power or hard power. It's the diminishing decline of liberalism's legitimacy. Liberalism masks itself under peace and benevolence as the way forward. When the United States invaded Iraq and imposed democracy upon that nation, American hegemony and democracy was shown actually to be malevolent and aggressive. As America waged its war on terror throughout the world in the wake of 9/11, it destabilized Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. It installed democracies within defeated enemies. But something interesting began to happen simultaneously. Countries which were either neutral or antagonistic to America began to have sweeping, fast, and well-organized revolutions. Color revolutions. The color revolutions began in Milosevic's Yugoslavia in 2000. And throughout the 2000s and 2010s, numerous countries which had oppositional policies towards the United States, and usually favorable policies towards the Russian Federation, had spontaneous revolutions erupt in them. These inexplicably well-organized flash mob revolutions would be unified under a simple symbol, often a color. They would occupy public spaces and force the leader of the country to flee or to call snap elections where they would be removed from power. Then the forces which took power in the wake of the color revolution would immediately ally with the United States in opposition to the Russian Federation. The countries of Russia and China hold to the belief that these revolutions are engineered by the U.S. State Department and its intelligence agencies. Many believe that the intelligence agencies are either allied or work through NGOs, who in their mission statements are supposed to be dedicated to democracy and human rights. George Soros and his Open Society foundations are often pointed to as the most transparent examples of these non-governmental organizations being used to organize AstroTurf mass political movements, and to undermine that country's national sovereignty and the native-born political movements. It is not directly provable that these color revolutions, which are often loosely defined, are a direct result of American and globalist influence. Meaning that until there is a direct evidence we can point to, I'm talking in the realm of conspiracy theory. Yet there's some clear circumstantial evidence of this conspiracy theory being true. The bulldozer revolution in Serbia, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, the Euromaidan Revolution in Ukraine, and the Velvet Revolution in Armenia, they all undermined Russian influence. All these revolutions prevented any further economic integration of the post-Soviet states and diplomatically isolated Russia. Even if these strikingly similar actions and results were somehow all organic in origin, the popular perception of them is that they're engineered by the American intelligence agencies. And that popular perception remains and proves to be the lesson which many around the world have taken to heart. As the leaders targeted and ultimately ousted from power, in many cases are democratically elected. The lesson is that democracy is only a real democracy if the American oligarchy approves of it. If your democracy is gonna, not approve gay marriage, that ain't a democracy. If your democracy is going to foster strong ties with Russia, that ain't a democracy. If your democracy is gonna be neutral towards America's geopolitical interests, that ain't a democracy. Due to the color revolutions and America's interventions throughout the Middle East following the Iraq War, its legitimacy has been undermined and its system of government and global hegemony undermined with it. Something that came in the wake of American hegemony was also the oligarchs and the international megacorporations which hijacked the economies and political systems of nations and forced them towards the new neoliberal world order in which no state would have sovereignty. Their world, the world that people call global homo, is one in which there are no borders and wealth is going to be hoarded by a small global elite, while the masses of the underdeveloped world and the formerly developed world are left to rot in ever-increasing poverty and austerity. The current international order, which is undermining the identity and sovereignty of all peoples and nations, is leading to a global backlash of nationalists throughout the world. Sometimes they maintain democracies in their native lands. Other times they see democracies as nothing more than a tool of these globalist oligarchs to destroy their people, and as such insulate their independence and protect their sovereignty by abandoning the system so open to the influence of that global elite. As the rootless cosmopolitan elite has taken the reins of the leadership throughout the West and have begun to impose their values upon the masses, democracy is increasingly defined by its adherence to so-called human rights rather than the practice of elections or even the natural rights of citizens. If states like Poland and Hungary outlaw gay marriage or limit illegal immigrants, then they cease to be considered democracies. The result is that democracies lose legitimacy as they are associated with social values that the majorities of most countries surrounding the world simply do not adhere to. As such, if a democratically elected leader supports economic trade with Russia, limits gay marriage, or direct rule by the Supreme Court, or limits immigration, and that country ceases to be considered a democracy. Thus, the definition of democracy is shifting from free elections in support of classic liberal rights into the ideology of sexual liberation and xenophilia. So essentially, a real democracy is esoterically defined as whatever the cathedral's policies are. It's interesting that countries like Brazil, Poland, Hungary, the United States, when the center-right party takes power, cease to become democracies because they criticize the kritarchy, the rule of the Supreme Courts in those countries, to legislate as a supermajority. So elections aren't democracy. What really is democracy in the eyes of the cathedral is these social values and xenophilia that ought to be imposed by fiat from a Supreme Court. I want to say, though, the advance of democracy will ultimately be contained by dysgenics. Less intelligent countries tend to have non-democratic cultures because they are unable to have the levels of social trust necessary to have free elections or a low enough level of corruption to do so. Industrial civilization, especially ones with welfare nets and a high participation of females in the workplace, are going to have crushingly low birth rates below replacement. And within these low birth rates, the less intelligent, less educated, and the more impulsive are going to breed. The dysgenics will drive down the ability of democracy to function and will ultimately result in its decline, backslide, and ultimate collapse. Once democracy means nothing more than the preference of bohemian elites rather than free elections or classical human rights in the eyes of most people, then the prestige of democracy declines. Populism, reinforced by nationalism, has already begun to emerge within the functioning electoral systems of many countries. And it's leading to a substantial class strife between elites and the working and middle classes. As such, the elites will condemn populism, as it is opposed to their class interests, and they will claim it is non-democratic, even though by its very definition it is democratic. And they are going to try and limit it through dictatorial means, as democracy threatens them. As populism rises, we should expect a further delegitimization of democracy, as those within the democratic governments and its bureaucracy will favor an elitist system, and those who would try to use democracy to push them out and foster policies which will help them will see democracy as ultimately an unwinnable game and start to support more aggressive forms of populism. What will the remaining democracies of the world collapse into then? There are multiple names for the regimes of the future. The dominant party system or the hybrid party system are the ones that are most commonly being used by political science circles today. These are systems in which there are multiple parties that contest in elections, but really there's only one ruling party who rules continually through fraudulent elections, corruption, or laws which limit the formation and creation of effective parties and their ability to participate. In effect, these are single-party states. Constitutionally, these states will be liberal democracies, but will effectively be run as single-party states, as any kind of real competition will become impossible. It's a decay of the political order, where liberal is held to be the ideology of the state and the most legitimate form of the government, but where the powers that be in the government will only play lip service to its values. Here elections will be held, but power will always remain effectively in the hands of a single ruling party. There are multiple ways for the single party to hold elections and maintain power. The first is to have false results, as we see in Russia. The second is to disallow entire ideologies from registering and competing. And that's an example best seen in Ukraine, where socialist and Russian minority interest parties are essentially banned, and all political parties are identical. Centrist, who support the aspirations and economic goals of the oligarchs and the mafia. The third is to have an uneducated populace who are united against a common scapegoat. And that's something you see in South Africa, where the African National Congress rules against the scapegoated whites, or how Venezuela and the socialism of the 21st century functioned at first before it transferred itself into fake elections. Finally, there is what Erdogan has done in Turkey, where the executive has gained so much power that the legislature becomes redundant. In effect, it's difficult, even with these examples, to separate the four, as each of the given examples, to some extent, has the four within it. And these four examples and four types of undermining legitimate elections feed into and reinforce each other. Ultimately, the future will be more authoritarian, but much less ideological than the 20th century. The single-party fascist states and the communist states, as well as democracies, are ideological things of the past. Instead, the future will be the cynical republics, which claim to be liberal democracies in their constitutions, but are effectively single-party states. These single-party states will either be one of two things. The first being largely non-ideological and controlled by highly corrupt business interests and mafia. This example of states are likely to be more nationalistic than the remaining liberal democracies or the other types of states. The second type is what I would call the socialism of the 21st century model, where the financially valuable scapegoats will be milked by the government for the benefit of shiftless, criminalistic masses, which are simply not intelligent enough to know better. In both of these examples, there's a way for the previous elites to somehow maintain their control, or be stripped of power and be replaced with old elites. Regardless, the common denominator is a future filled with highly corrupt and incompetent states which will be incapable of tackling the multitude of disasters which it will face.